You are about to listen to an abridged recording of WFD's Democracy Expertise Exchange on Electoral Reform, an online webinar that took place on 17th of March 2026.
Democratic backsliding and rising authoritarianism threaten people, communities, and countries everywhere. And although polls show that people are still committed to democratic principles and practices, they are losing trust in their political systems and their politicians. This crisis, as I'm sure you're all aware, is global. Every country and community is affected. But democracy is not the problem, it is the answer. And far from abandoning principles of people's right to choose their government, hold people with power to account, and indeed to vote in free and fair elections, now is the moment to recommit and ensure democracy can endure, evolve, and succeed. We know that ensuring electoral integrity is a vital part of that effort. And at WFD, we believe that developing and sharing expertise and learning is part of the way forward for democracy support actors and others. So this series, our expertise event series, convenes experts and practitioners to share learning and their latest developments in democracy strengthening. And we're kicking off the series, why you're all here today, by focusing on electoral integrity. So thanks for joining us. My name is Steph Lever. I'll be hosting the exchange today, and we'll be speaking to Tanya Holstein, who is our in-house elections expert, and she'll give a really brief presentation on our thinking and latest resources. And then we will open up the conversation, and we really do want this to be an exchange. So we're encouraging comments, questions, and the sharing of your own work and insights. We really want to know what you are working on too. And so we're just going to start with maybe 5 to 10 minutes, depending on how things go, with Tanya, who is our head of practice for elections. Tanya has built her expertise on elections and democratization over more than 20 years of experience. She's worked for UNDP, OSCE, the EU, and of course now WFD, and she's taught practical electoral assistance at the University of Dusseldorf. So Tanya, my first question to you is, for this 5 minutes of introduction, is could you explain why does WFD focus on electoral reform within the electoral cycle?
Yeah, thank you, Steph. Yes, it does not seem to be the most obvious choice when thinking about electoral integrity, even though it is the topic running the longest throughout the electoral cycle. And we started looking at electoral reform roughly 6 years ago. And already in 2019, the very low uptake of electoral recommendations, mainly the ones observer missions brought forward, had made in their final report, was a continuous challenge, even in mostly democratic countries, something we noticed. So these recommendations constitute a good starting point for reforms by being written in a very supportive manner, sorted by actor and by topic. This challenge of implementation caught our eye. It should actually have been a very straightforward thing to do, but it wasn't. So we ask ourselves the question why electoral recommendations were largely not implemented to improve the quality of elections, and what was the rationale of those ones that had been implemented, that were the actual point of our question. So we conducted research in Ghana, Kenya, Liberia, Nigeria, and Uganda. We wanted to start regional on that matter, around electoral recommendations, and found that implementation became more likely when civil society groups build cohesive and coherent coalitions, increasing domestic pressure for change, and it became less likely when it seemed to endanger the political status quo. And that was a very interesting point for us. So at this point, it was clear that changes to the electoral legislation, which is more than the actual electoral code, which we all refer to all the time, and it can include, for example, political party law, media legislation, as well as constitutional in some countries, they have a direct impact on the political process in a country and respectively the electoral process, meaning that any reform, no matter how small or how big, can be a key turning point for all political actors and stakeholders. So it was this dynamic we were interested in to better understand when and how electoral reform impact the quality and integrity of elections, and therefore the political situation in the country in a positive or in a negative way. So this was the key idea we were looking at. So based on our findings, we understood or still understand, that electoral reform is a political, not a technical process. And this is one of the key messages I would like to give today, that we're looking at a political, not a technical process. And to support the quality of elections or electoral integrity, and therefore the trust in the wider political system, it needs to be seen as such. And that's a key thing, a key understanding we filtered out over the years. So the overall question that appeared for us in this context was, when does reform lead to an entrenchment of power and erosion of trust? And when to more electoral integrity and a rise of trust? So in short, what does constitute a conducive electoral reform? And WFD chose to work on electoral reform to support partners in this often very complex process, as we are positioned at the intersection of government institutions, political parties, and civil society actors, and we are able to support stakeholders from various angles of this context.
Thanks so much. I think that's really interesting to think about why post kind of election observer missions, when experts have gone in and made recommendations about what reforms should be made. It's what you're saying, that they often weren't happening, and that's what we wanted to look into. And looking into that has made us convinced that the way to think about electoral reform is as a political process, not a technical one.
Yeah.
So just to bring this to life a little bit more, I wondered if you could give an example maybe of where an electoral reform process had reduced trust in the system and why, and one where it was kind of conducive to stronger electoral integrity and trust.
Yes, a very good point. Yeah, I have two examples, actually. So we have seen a successful case in South Africa where reforms were adopted to allow independent candidates to stand as a new category in the 2024 elections, national and provincial elections. So the reform originated in a legal challenge brought by a non-profit organization, so outside of the government sector, which argued that existing electoral law was unconstitutional. And the Constitutional Court ruled in favor of the appellant. So when that had happened, the decision prompted the government to establish a ministerial advisory committee on electoral reform. And the 8-member committee was formed, comprising of representatives from the independent electoral body, academics, the former chairperson of the Municipal Demarcation Board. So a very broad-based committee. So the committee invited public submissions and conducted its own research on electoral systems. Based on its report, the minister developed proposed legislation, which was then considered by the National Assembly Committee. And only after this process, a rather lengthy process of gathering evidence and consult people, only after that was completed, the bill was presented to the House of the National Assembly for debate and approval. So the key to success was an open deliberation process. Reforms do not cater only for the interest of one actor, which can lead to mistrust and often rejection of electoral results. So that was a very good example in South Africa to encompass all the different views and concerns as well, while constructing a new law. So on the other hand, an unsuccessful case presented Hungary, actually very close to home. So here the electoral reforms fundamentally changed the electoral system in 2011 and in 2024. The legislation was passed without support from the opposition. The bills were submitted by MPs rather than the government, and there was no prior public consultation, and it was impossible to know which actor and expert prepared the draft. So the parliamentary passage was also truncated. The initial bill in 2010 was introduced without debate at all, while the 2011 bill only allowed a month before passage, which is a very, very tight time frame for any sort of parliamentary deliberation. So the 24 reform draft was submitted by a member of parliament on the 19th of November 24 and adopted by parliament barely a month later on the 20th December 24. So again, almost no time to do any sort of meaningful consultation. There were also little public justifications and evidence presented, and stakeholders questioned the intent of the reform and the wider process, the elections, and then of the outcome as well. So in the South African case, there is a lot of trust in the electoral process as well as in the outcome. Whereas in the Hungary case, the public trust in elections and the results is rather low and it is declining, as we can see from the electoral integrity index as well. which collects data over years already.
Thanks, Tanya. I think that really helped us to kind of bring it to life with a couple of examples. I think that was pretty close to the 5 minutes with you that we wanted to do as an introduction. So I'm going to hand over to you now to do a short kind of more formal presentation of some of our latest thinking and resources. So I'll ask you one more question to kick off, Tanya, and that is, what are the key areas we need to focus on in future to conduct successful electoral reform processes?
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Steph. Yeah, the slides are just a support, so there are not that many and they're not really full. So yeah, to answer the question, I will focus on 3 areas today. It's the process, deliberation, and participation. And I will talk about the process first before I will highlight some of the work we are doing, highlighting the work we are doing also in other areas. So as we saw from the example of South Africa and Hungary, the process is a key piece for improving elections in many areas. But exactly here we identified, and it's not that long ago, a critical research gap, as most publications were focused on the content of specific reform undertaking, basically the legislation. Nearly none was actually focused on the process, how this takes place. So to bridge this gap, WFD began in cooperation with the Global Network for Securing Electoral Integrity, which was launched in 2023. And you can find it on our website as well if you haven't heard about it yet. And here I'd like to specifically mention also my colleague, Michael McNulty, who is former USAID, and he and we worked on this very concentrated for quite a long time to develop a set of principles serving as building blocks for a conducive reform process that would improve the quality of the elections and help stabilize trust in the election and subsequent political systems. So we identified in this process 6 principles which we see as important to conduct a conducive/democratic electoral reform process, leaning on democracy theory as well. So this is not absolutely new. And these principles were published in 2024, and they are downloadable from our website, from IFES website, and I think from IDEA as well. So these 6 principles I was speaking about for a conducive or democratic reform are the following. Political consensus is an essential goal for any electoral reform process. To avoid the process being overtaken by narrow interest, reform process should minimize opportunities for polarization. So that was the first one we were thinking about. The second one, the process needs to be transparent. Why is it conducted? What needs to be changed? By whom does it need to be changed? What are the timelines? What is the budget? All of that needs to be transparent for all actors involved, not only for the government. Inclusiveness, consultation processes of all relevant actors and potentially the public, depending on the reform level. I mean, if you have constitutional reform, that might require public consultation. If you have procedural reform, which can be done most of the time by election commissions, you might only have a certain amount of stakeholders being consulted. Evidence and long-term vision based. So that means agreeing on evidence and what should be accomplished through the reform. So there are different statistics, numbers, evidence bases. So you need to agree on one from which you want to start the process. This is already a deliberation process to come to the agreed evidence base, which can already take quite a long time. And then have a long-term vision so that you don't have to change every electoral cycle. Adequate timeframes and resources. Different consultation processes need different timeframes and a different amount of money. All that needs to be given. If it's not given, you need to adjust the process. And number 6, last but not least, clear accountability structure. Who is responsible for what? The parliament, the election commission, civil society. What is the decision-making mechanism? So who's taking decisions? What is the last decision and how is this made? So all these points we put into the principles, which I said you can download and you can see them here on the screen as well. That was what we put together. So to test these developed principles and assess their relevance, WFD, in cooperation with the Electoral Integrity Project, most of you might have heard about it, and specifically Professor Toby James, conducted an online workshop in March 25, looking at 14 country case studies led by experts in democracy, hybrid regimes, and autocracies. These are actually, it's a global reach, I would say. We're going from Peru over the Netherlands to the US and India. So it's really a good case study conglomerate, so that we can base our findings on. So these materials, these 14 case studies, introduction, conclusions, all of it, are compiled into an edited book with Oxford University Press, and we hope that this will be released in the last quarter of 26, where we have all these things included and combined. So the analysis of these 14 case studies brought us 4 new insights. The first one was that not all our assumptions actually hold. We assumed that the political consensus, our first principle, would be a key precondition for conducive or democratic electoral reform, but we understood that it can also be counterproductive as it is not always established by consultation, but it can be established also by repression, by insufficient attention, the absence of minority voices, or media bias. So just having a consensus around an electoral reform doesn't mean that everybody is behind it and that it was done in a consultative way. So secondly, there's a clear set of barriers that impact consensus as well. The principles and therefore democratic electoral reform also in areas where we did not expect it. So the first barrier was a set of in real politics. So we have rule makers have entrenched interests. As I said before, we found that recommendations were not implemented when they were not conducive to the status quo. Public distrust of political elites is in some countries very high and a real political barrier. We also found structural barriers like personalization of political power is one. Political polarization that in many countries might not allow for deliberation and consensus in the first place. Political violence, the information environment hampering deliberation and consensus building, which we all know how the social media information environment is problematic these days. Electoral observers are denied access, so we have a lack of evidence, and we don't have recommendations for that matter. Another one is inappropriate parliamentary procedures, legislation proposed through inappropriate parliamentary channels, parliamentary processes were breached, or we have fast-tracked legislation. So these are all other barriers to a conducive deliberation process, as we had it in South Africa, for example, to come to a good outcome. And the lack of proper evidence, that's also always a big problem. So thirdly, there's a high relevance and value of the principles that we also proved. As not following the principles, and we found this in the case studies, it led to declining trust. For example, in the UK, the government developed policy through an external committee run by a former party chair. There was a lack of transparency and poor quality evidence used, and mistrust about the government's motives then followed. Then we have, for example, poor laws being an outcome. In Peru, the high number of fragmented last-minute reforms have led to a system of more than 50 overlapping laws and temporary provisions, which, of course, at one point you can't untangle anymore, and it really creates problems. And then there's another one, for example, a loss of electoral officials. In the Netherlands, voting machines had been used for more than 40 years. When they were withdrawn, a lot of experienced poll workers quit because they did not feel included in the decision-making process of going into a new process for voting, which I found very interesting. So in fourth, we identified new lessons, new policy lessons that should be taken into consideration to support a democratic electoral reform process in different political systems. So this is not necessarily depending. We had this discussion that is only for democratic systems. No, it can be done in other systems as well. It's just different levels of depth in which it can be done. So the first policy lesson would be establish cross-party working groups, dialogue forums for civil society, which is not entirely new. We have this around elections, but it is new around electoral reform, because it's usually never done, at least not over a long time frame. So secondly, vigilance on the parliamentary processes. There is not a big connection between parliamentary processes and electoral reform yet. So it's something we really need to look into. Use of cross-party parliamentary committees to examine bills before they're actually adopted. And for specific legislative pathways for electoral legislation. So that prevents them from considering being money bills, for example, which have limited scrutiny in this case. Fifth, allow for an inclusive and transparent process without limiting the options for reform before the start of the discussion. Leave it open. Do not prescribe which direction this needs to go. And six, there is a strong judiciary, was a positive correlation with consensus. That is also something which we saw in the case studies. So based on the case studies, we concluded that the global network for securing electoral integrity principles, the 6 I just lined out, are important point references which should be used by stakeholders worldwide to undertake electoral reform. So they are valid and they are important. Consensus is sought during the electoral reform process, but not seen as the only or main principle to be followed. Consensus can often be a barrier to necessarily electoral reform, actually. However, by focusing on the other principles, the other 5, it may enable consensus to be formed. So the dynamic between these 6 principles is actually quite important, and we don't have to start from a position of consensus. Principle number 4, which is the electoral reform process should be informed by evidence and long-term visions, the one I lined out, should include a focus on deliberative principles. So that is something we add to the principles at the moment, and we will reprint them and rework them to some extent. That there is a reason, justification, and counter-argument are considered by stakeholders based on evidence. So this deliberative practice is something we really need to put into focus, additional to the other 6 principles I lined out. So to help realize the principles, the findings suggest that it is helpful to think about the electoral reform process sequentially, and therefore proposed as an electoral reform policy cycle as a heuristic tool to guide the process. You can see the policy cycle here on the screen. It is also in any of the documentations. So in the policy brief, for example, or it will also be in the book where you can read in more detail what needs to be done on the different stages. I will not go into it at the moment. Yeah, that was it for me. And I was very happy to be able to introduce our thinking and our work to you. And I'm very happy to take anything you will give us, inputs, comments, critics, so we can potentially work more on this area. And there are a lot of strategic barriers that still need to be looked into a little bit more closely so that we find the dynamics behind it and then can work on these rather not connected areas to electoral reform, but are important to electoral reform to get the reform process on the way and have the principles being taken up on a global level. Thank you.
Westminster Foundation for Democracy is the UK public body dedicated to strengthening democracy around the world. Find out more at www.wfd.org.